It begins not with the crowning of a king, but with a whisper in the dark corridors of a royal court, the kind of whisper that stains a dynasty, the kind that lingers long after the throne has been polished and the crown lifted high. The story of Stephen II of Hungary is one of shadows as much as sunlight, and at its very heart stands a woman draped in Byzantine silk, whose very presence would both stabilize and destabilize a kingdom. To understand their union, one must first trace the fault lines that cracked long before he wore the crown. Stephen's life opened under a cloud of suspicion. His mother, Euphemia of Kiev, was a Russ's princess, daughter of Vladimir II Monomach, whose marriage to King Koloman of Hungary was meant to cement an alliance across the Carpathians. Yet almost as soon as she stepped into her role as queen, scandal engulfed her. Chroniclers, whether poisoned by political enemies or reflecting truth, accused her of adultery. In a court obsessed with lineage and bloodlines, that accusation was enough to destroy her place beside Koloman. She was sent back to Kiev in disgrace, her honor shattered. But she left behind her infant son, Stephen. The boy would grow under the gaze of suspicion, forever branded with the uncertainty of legitimacy. Was he truly Koloman's child, or was he the product of betrayal? The chronicles do not answer. They leave the doubt hanging like a blade above his head. This wound at the root of his existence shaped his destiny. Even as he was recognized as heir, whispers corroded the foundations of trust. A boy who would be king was already a boy marked by doubt. His childhood unfolded in a court where nobles weighed every gesture, every flicker of weakness, wondering whether he carried not only the blood of a king, but the curse of dishonor. He learned early that power was not inherited without suspicion, and legitimacy was not a crown, but a battlefield. Far to the south in Constantinople, another child was being shaped by destiny. Born into the imperial Komnenos dynasty, she was surrounded not by whispers of scandal, but by the blinding brilliance of empire. The Byzantine court was a theater of marble halls and golden mosaics, of rituals designed to remind every courtier of the emperor's semi-divine status. Here, in the very navel of the Christian East, the Komnenos princess was raised with the weight of diplomacy sewn into her garments. She was taught that her future was not her own, that her beauty and lineage were currency in a world of fragile alliances. If Stephen was a child of doubt, she was a child of empire. Together, their paths would intersect at a moment when Hungary needed legitimacy, and Byzantium sought to bind its neighbors with threads of marriage. She was raised to kneel at altars, to move through the world like a vessel of dynastic strategy. Her fate was never to rule in Constantinople, but to be sent outward, a living gift, a silent pledge that emperors made to kings. And in the fragile kingdom of Hungary, she would be asked to play a role far greater than that of a bride. When Koloman the Learned died in 1116, Stephen was only 15. A boy's hand was lifted toward the crown, but behind the pageantry lay vulnerability. His father had been a king of formidable intellect, a man who codified laws, expanded territories, and subdued his rivals with both mind and sword. Stephen inherited none of the security that Koloman had forged. Instead, he stepped into a world of predators. Hungary was a frontier kingdom, stretched between east and west, coveted by Venice on the Adriatic, threatened by Austria and Bavaria to the west, and eyed cautiously by Byzantium to the south. It was a prize as much as a throne, and a boy's crown invited both ambition and contempt. The coronation itself was grand, but beneath the solemn chants of bishops and the blaze of candles in the cathedral, the doubt still simmered. Some nobles muttered about his mother's scandal. Others whispered that the young king was frail in body, untested in war. Yet the holy oil was poured, the crown of Saint Stephen was lowered onto his head, and in that moment, whatever the doubts, Hungary had a king. Still, kingship was not enough. What the boy needed was strength beside him, legitimacy that could not be questioned. And so the Byzantine alliance was forged. The Komnenos princess arrived in Hungary not long after Stephen's coronation. Imagine her journey, leaving behind the marble palaces of Constantinople, the great dome of Hagia Sophia glittering in the sun, and sailing northward into a land of thick forests and harsh plains, where castles stood less refined, where the air smelled of pine and earth rather than incense and sea salt. She was not yet 20, but she carried herself as though trained for centuries in the art of queenship. For Hungary, she was a treasure, proof that Byzantium respected the boy king enough to bind itself by blood. For Stephen, she was both wife and shield, an anchor against the tides of doubt. Their marriage was a spectacle of politics, a union not born of passion but of necessity. Yet within that necessity lay the possibility of trust, of intimacy forged not through desire, but through survival. The queen was watched with suspicion. She was foreign, her language heavy with Greek cadences, her manners steeped in Byzantine ritual. Some nobles derided her as an outsider, an agent of Constantinople. Others courted her favor, hoping to rise in influence through her. She quickly learned that Hungary was not Byzantium. Here the court was harsher, the nobles more unruly, the church more entangled with politics. She had stepped into a kingdom where the throne was less secure, and the queen's position more precarious. For Stephen, her presence was a paradox. She gave him prestige, yet also fed the whispering doubts of those who saw Byzantine influence as a threat to Hungarian independence. But in the quiet chambers of the palace, away from the noise of nobles and clergy, the boy king and his Byzantine queen began to build something fragile, a partnership forged by necessity, tested by war, and haunted by the absence of children. As Hungary looked outward to Venice, Austria, and Byzantium, Stephen looked inward toward survival. His crown rested not only on his head, but on her shoulders as well. She was not merely a wife, she was a symbol, a lightning rod, a guardian of legitimacy. Yet she was also a young woman torn from her homeland, navigating a foreign court where every gesture could be misread, every word twisted into accusation. This was the stage of their early years, a boy king marked by scandal, a Byzantine princess marked by empire, and a kingdom poised between hope and ruin. Their lives were entwined not by choice but by necessity, yet together they would face the storms that soon gathered over Hungary. For the Adriatic winds were rising, Venice was sharpening its fleets, and in the shadows of the palace, nobles already plotted the weakening of the crown. The story of Stephen does not begin with triumph. It begins with fragility, with a crown that glimmers but trembles, with a queen whose silks hide a heart that must learn to survive in a kingdom of wolves. And it begins with a paradox, that sometimes the strength of a king is not his sword, but the silent endurance of the woman beside him. The cathedral of Székesfehérvár glowed with candles, their flames trembling in the shadows as the young Stephen approached the altar. He was only 15, yet already burdened with a crown that seemed heavier than iron. The bishops lifted their voices in chant, invoking the lineage of Saint Stephen, the first Christian king of Hungary, as though to wrap the boy in the memory of saints to mask his youth and weakness. But beneath the solemn liturgy lay the unease of the court. Nobles shifted in their seats, whispering among themselves. They remembered his mother's disgrace, remembered the scandals of infidelity, remembered how doubt clung to this boy like a shadow. The oil poured upon his head could sanctify his reign, but it could not erase the whispers. When the crown was lowered, the weight of history pressed down upon Stephen's brow. It was not merely a coronation, it was a wager. Hungary's magnates placed a bet that this boy could hold the kingdom together. Some prayed for it. Others secretly hoped for his failure. For failure meant opportunity, lands to be seized, power to be redistributed. The clergy, meanwhile, saw him as malleable, young enough to be molded into their image of piety, pliant enough to extend church privileges. In those first days, Stephen was more symbol than sovereign. It was his youth that defined him, a vulnerability visible to every faction that circled the throne. He had no record of victories, no scars of battle, no hardened wisdom. All he had was a name, a crown, and the burden of proving that he was more than a figurehead. And so, into this fragile moment, the Byzantine marriage was thrust like a lifeline. The Komnenos princess arrived with the pomp of empire. Her retinue carried silks and icons, the gilded crosses of Constantinople glinting as if to remind the Hungarians that their new queen came from a world where power radiated like the sun. To Stephen's nobles, her presence was double-edged. She was proof that Byzantium had acknowledged the boy king, binding him to the great Komnenos dynasty. But she was also a reminder that foreign influence could seep into Hungarian veins, that the Danube might carry not only trade, but the ambitions of Constantinople. The wedding was staged as a spectacle of unity. Bells rang, choirs lifted their voices, and nobles feasted under vaulted halls. The young king, slight in frame, stood beside his bride, her posture regal, her bearing unmistakably imperial. The contrast was stark. He was boyish, pale, his features not yet hardened by time. She was radiant with the confidence of a dynasty that had ruled Byzantium for generations. In that moment, Hungary's fragility was veiled by Byzantine grandeur. Yet marriage did not silence suspicion. At court, Hungarian magnates muttered that the Komnenos queen might act as a spy for Constantinople, that she would bend Stephen toward Byzantine interests. Others claimed she was Hungary's salvation, a divine sign that God had not abandoned the boy king. She herself, young and far from home, learned to move with caution. Her every gesture was studied. Her words weighed for signs of treachery. She could not afford missteps, for in this land she was both crown and foreigner. For Stephen, the marriage offered more than prestige. In the silence of his private chambers, where the crown was set aside and the weight of rule lifted briefly, the queen was the one constant. She was his partner in a world that doubted him, a companion who had no choice but to share his fate. If she was a gift from Byzantium, she was also his shield against isolation. Yet their bond was not free of tension. He, the son of scandal, carried insecurity in his very bones. She, the daughter of empire, carried authority in her bearing. In their marriage, the imbalance of confidence was as palpable as the imbalance of power in Hungary itself. The kingdom around them, meanwhile, seethed with dangers. Venice, ambitious and hungry, eyed Dalmatian ports that Hungary claimed. To the west, Austria and Bavaria pushed at the borders, testing the strength of the young king's armies. To the south, Byzantium itself balanced alliance with calculation, keeping Hungary close but never fully trusting it. Stephen's youth invited challenge, and his reign, barely begun, already stood at risk of unraveling. The queen saw the fragility firsthand. From the windows of the royal palace, she watched as emissaries came and went, their faces etched with agendas. She listened as bishops pressed for privileges, as nobles demanded lands, as generals pleaded for resources. She witnessed her husband's struggle to assert authority, to speak with a voice that carried weight, and she understood that her role was not to remain silent, but to stand as a symbol of legitimacy. She could not wield a sword, but she could embody the connection between Hungary and Byzantium, a bridge that, if strong enough, might keep predators at bay. But the strain was visible. In council chambers, nobles sometimes spoke over Stephen, treating him as if he were still a boy. The queen, seated beside him, would fix her gaze on them with the composure of Constantinople, her silence sharper than rebuke. It was not authority she wielded, but presence. And presence, in a kingdom on the edge of weakness, could be as powerful as any decree. Still, cracks widened. Stephen's health began to show signs of fragility. He suffered bouts of illness, his energy often waning when vigor was most required. Whispers grew louder. Perhaps God had cursed him, perhaps the blood of scandal had poisoned his body. Each rumor gnawed at his authority, and each time he faltered, the queen's role expanded, not in official titles, but in the invisible weight she carried. She became not only wife, but caretaker, counselor, shield. Her Byzantine training, her composure under scrutiny, allowed her to bear this weight in silence. The early years of their reign together were not marked by triumphs, but by survival. Every feast, every liturgy, every diplomatic gesture was a battle in disguise, and in the background loomed the storm of Venice, whose fleets prepared to clash with Hungary's fragile armies. Stephen wore the crown of a boy king, but the queen by his side wore the burden of two realms, Byzantium's gift and Hungary's suspicion. Their union was fragile yet essential, a thread binding together a kingdom that threatened to unravel at every seam. And so their reign moved forward, not on the wings of victories, but under the shadow of doubt. A boy crowned in fear, a queen crowned in foreign silk, and a kingdom that tested them at every turn. The Adriatic was already stirring with the winds of war, and soon both king and queen would discover that crowns, no matter how holy, could not shield them from the storms of history. The Adriatic Sea has always been more than water. It is a mirror of ambition, a stage where empires test their strength against the waves. For centuries, Dalmatian ports had been the prize, gateways to trade, power, and prestige. To Venice, they were lifeblood. To Hungary, they were the proof that the kingdom could stand shoulder to shoulder with the great maritime powers. And for Stephen, barely crowned and still unsteady in his throne, they became the crucible that would define the first years of his reign. The Venetians came like storms. Their fleets were not mere ships, but floating fortresses, sails heavy with the wind of centuries of seafaring. When Stephen inherited the crown, Dalmatia was already contested ground. His father Coloman had held it with a firm hand, but no sooner had the boy king taken power than Venice pressed its advantage, moving swiftly to reclaim what it believed was rightfully theirs. It was the perfect moment, a kingdom ruled by a child, led by generals divided among themselves, watched over by nobles more concerned with estates than battlefields. Stephen could not ignore the insult. Dalmatia was not just territory, it was pride, the very face of Hungary on the Adriatic. To lose it without a fight would be to invite scorn from neighbors and rebellion from within. And so, though untested, he called upon his armies. The banners of Hungary unfurled, crimson and white fluttering against the sky, as knights and infantry marched toward the coast. The boy king was determined to prove he was no puppet, that his crown bore weight beyond ceremonial oil. The queen watched these preparations with a heart split in two. Raised in Constantinople, she understood the ruthless arithmetic of empire. Wars were not always won by courage, but by resources, strategy, and timing. She knew Hungary was fragile, its armies inexperienced, its command fractured. Yet she also saw the desperation in her husband's eyes, the need to prove himself, to silence the whispers of illegitimacy, to show the world that a boy could wear the crown of St. Stephen with honor. For him, this war was not just about Dalmatia, it was about existence itself. The campaign began with bravado. Stephen's forces marched with confidence, the drums of war echoing across plains and valleys. But confidence could not shield them from reality. The Venetians struck with precision, their fleets dominating the sea, their soldiers fortified along the coast. Hungarian forces, unaccustomed to maritime warfare, stumbled against defenses designed by generations of Venetian cunning. The battles were swift, brutal, and humiliating. One by one, Dalmatian cities fell into Venetian hands. The news reached the queen in the palace, each defeat a dagger to the fragile authority of her husband. Courtiers whispered more openly now. Some claimed the war was folly, the reckless gamble of a boy desperate for validation. Others pointed to her presence, the Byzantine bride, suggesting that foreign influence had led Hungary into a disaster. She bore the weight of these accusations in silence, her face composed, her voice measured. But in her private chambers, the grief pressed heavily upon her. She had been raised to embody stability, yet here she was, tethered to a king, faltering before the eyes of Christendom. For Stephen, the defeats were more than military. They were personal humiliations. He returned from the front not as a conquering king, but as a chastened boy. His crown now heavier with shame. His health, already fragile, worsened under the strain. Some said it was the toll of the battlefield. Others whispered again of divine punishment, that God had cursed his reign because of his mother's sin or his own inadequacy. Each whisper gnawed at him, driving him deeper into despair. The queen became his only constant. In the quiet of the palace, she tended to him, offering not only care, but the strength of her presence. She reminded him of the dignity still left to him, the legitimacy their marriage represented, the bond to Byzantium that kept Hungary from isolation. Yet even she could not erase the scars of failure. Together they sat beneath tapestries depicting past Hungarian victories, and together they felt the weight of the contrast, the glories of ancestors versus the defeats of the present. The nobles, emboldened by the king's weakness, began to push further. They seized lands, demanded privileges, and acted as though the crown's authority were theirs to manipulate. The queen, though foreign, began to play her role quietly in this shifting balance. She sought allies where she could, using her Byzantine heritage as both shield and sword. Some nobles despised her for it, accusing her of meddling, while others saw in her the strength Stephen lacked. Her influence was subtle, yet unmistakable. In the palace's silence, her words often weighed more than the king's faltering commands. But the Adriatic humiliation left a permanent mark. Dalmatia, once a jewel of Hungarian pride, slipped fully into Venetian hands. The kingdom lost not only territory, but reputation. To Europe, Hungary seemed a faltering state, ruled by a sickly king, defended by disunited nobles, held together only by the veneer of Byzantine connection through its queen. For Stephen, the loss deepened his insecurity. For his queen, it sharpened her resolve. If Hungary could not win by arms, then survival would demand subtler weapons, alliances, diplomacy, endurance. And so the reign of Stephen entered its next phase, marked not by triumph, but by adaptation. The queen learned that her role would not be merely ornamental. She would be the quiet strategist, the foreign presence who could steady the court when her husband's strength failed. Yet each step she took deeper into politics drew sharper eyes upon her. In the memory of Hungary, victories are celebrated, but failures breed suspicion. And in the shadow of defeat, the queen's foreign blood made her both target and scapegoat. The Adriatic winds had carried more than war. They had carried a truth that Stephen could no longer escape. He was not his father. He was not Coloman the Learned, the lawgiver, the conqueror, the ruler of Dalmatia. He was Stephen, a king defined not by what he gained, but by what he lost. And in that loss, it was his queen who bore the silence of survival. Even as the kingdom braced for further storms, the crown had been placed on the head of a boy, and after Dalmatia, it began to feel as though the crown itself was devouring him. Stephen was still young, still supposed to be stepping into his strength, yet already his body betrayed him. He was often pale, his frame weakened by bouts of fever and exhaustion, his voice sometimes trembling when the weight of counsel required firmness. The nobles saw it, the clergy saw it, and most painfully, his Byzantine queen saw it each night when the doors of the audience chamber closed and the king collapsed into silence. The defeats against Venice had stripped away the aura of invincibility that kingship demanded. Hungary's lords, always eager to test the limits of authority, began to sense that they could press harder, that their sovereign lacked the energy to resist. What had once been whispered became open practice. Lands claimed by right of crown were seized by magnates, tax revenues siphoned into private coffers, privileges expanded without royal consent. In every encroachment, the authority of the king shrank. The queen, still young herself, was forced to grow into a role she had not chosen. Raised in the Byzantine court, she had been taught how to carry herself in splendor, how to embody dignity at ceremonies, how to stand as a jewel in the crown of an emperor. But Hungary demanded something harsher. Here, a queen could not simply glitter, she had to endure. She had to hold together what her husband was too weak to defend. And so, in the council chambers, where Hungarian lords bickered and maneuvered, her silence became a weapon. When her husband faltered, her gaze carried the weight of Constantinople's authority. When his voice grew faint, her composure restored the image of dignity that was slipping from him. But such power came at a cost. The nobles resented her foreign blood, whispering that she meddled too much, that she was not a true daughter of Hungary. Priests whispered darker suspicions, that Byzantium had planted her to corrupt the kingdom from within, to bend it into the service of Constantinople. These were not truths but tools, sharpened by those who wanted to weaken the crown further. Yet gossip has a way of growing sharper than swords, and each rumor cut deeper into her standing. At the heart of their marriage, the burden pressed heavily. Stephen, racked by illness and shame, often withdrew into silence. The queen, left alone with her thoughts, confronted her own kind of solitude. She was a stranger in this land, married into a dynasty that did not wholly accept her, tethered to a king who needed her, yet could not protect her from the poison of suspicion. Still, she remained by his side, caring for him with a devotion that was as much political necessity as personal loyalty. She tended to him during his fevers, steadied him in his weakness, and reminded him, sometimes in words, more often in her mere presence, that the crown still sat upon his head. The court around them, however, became a battlefield of ambition. Magnates tested their power, drawing soldiers to their banners as though anticipating the collapse of royal authority. Alliances shifted like sand, each lord calculating how much longer this fragile king could endure. Into this chaos, the queen was forced to step carefully. She could not command armies, but she could command perception. In every ceremony, she dressed in the finest silks her retinue had carried from Constantinople. Her appearance a deliberate assertion that the crown was not broken, that Byzantium itself stood behind her husband. It was theater, but theater mattered. In a world where weakness was fatal, the illusion of strength could buy time. Yet illusions could not cure a failing body. Stephen's illnesses grew more frequent, his youth eroded by a weariness that seemed far older than his years. Some suspected that poison had been administered, perhaps by nobles who desired his fall. Others muttered of divine justice, that God punished him for his mother's scandal, or for his father's sins, or for his own failures against Venice. The queen rejected such superstitions, yet even she could not deny that each passing season left him thinner, more fragile. The throne seemed less a seat of power than a chair of suffering. Still, their marriage, tested by weakness, deepened into a strange intimacy. They were bound not by passion or children, but by shared vulnerability. She became his shield, his advocate, his nurse, his echo. He in turn became her anchor, the reason she endured suspicion and exile in this foreign land. Together they carried the weight of a kingdom that seemed intent on devouring them both. But outside the palace walls, Hungary grew restless. To the west, Austrian and Bavarian forces pressed the border, sensing opportunity. To the south, Byzantium played its careful game, alternating between support and exploitation. And to the Adriatic, Venice grew fat on the spoils of Dalmatia, its fleets now unchallenged. In this storm, Stephen's health was not merely a private tragedy, it was a national crisis. For if he fell, the crown itself would falter, and Hungary's very survival would be at risk. In these years, the queen's presence mattered more than ever. She was not beloved, but she was indispensable. She was the living symbol that Hungary still held imperial connections, that despite weakness, the crown was not abandoned. Yet she carried this burden in silence, without the songs of chroniclers, without the honor of triumphs. Her power was invisible, her labor thankless, her influence recorded only in the endurance of a throne that might otherwise have collapsed. And so, the price of youth and weakness was paid not only by Stephen, but by his queen. His frailty drained the kingdom's strength, while her resilience preserved what little dignity remained. Together, they embodied the paradox of Hungary's fate: a king too weak to rule, a queen too foreign to lead. And yet somehow, through their fragile partnership, the kingdom endured. But the storm clouds thickened. Hungary's wolves grew bolder, the borders more restless, the nobles more arrogant. And soon, the question would no longer be whether Stephen could survive his crown, but whether the crown itself could survive him. The kingdom of Hungary sat at a crossroads, a narrow strip of earth between titans. To the west stretched the Holy Roman Empire, where emperors wrapped themselves in papal approval and dreamed of dominion over all Christendom. To the south glimmered Byzantium, heir to Rome's majesty, its emperors draped in purple and crowned by patriarchs who claimed divine authority independent of Rome. Between them lay Hungary, not a great empire but a prize, a passage, a buffer. And in the fragile reign of Stephen, the crossroads became a battlefield of faith and politics. The papacy extended its hand toward Hungary with the velvet of blessing and the iron of expectation. Rome sought to tighten its grip, demanding privileges for clergy, protection for papal envoys, and obedience to its decrees. Each concession weakened royal power, yet to refuse risked excommunication, a punishment that could unravel a kingdom already trembling under suspicion. The bishops of Hungary, aligned with Rome, pressed for more authority, more wealth, more independence from the crown. To them, Stephen's weakness was opportunity, and the papacy their shield. At the same time, Byzantium whispered across the Danube, reminding Hungary of its alliance through marriage. The Komnenos queen was a living bond to Constantinople, her presence a constant reminder that the empire could be both ally and overseer. Byzantium did not demand obedience in faith, but it expected loyalty in politics. It sought Hungarian neutrality when convenient, Hungarian support when necessary, and Hungarian subservience if opportunity allowed. Stephen's throne was valuable to them not for its strength, but for its position. And so Hungary was pulled in two directions, Rome to the west, Byzantium to the south, each claiming a piece of its soul. The queen felt this tension more sharply than anyone. Born into the Komnenos dynasty, her blood tied her to Byzantium. Every time a Byzantine envoy arrived at court, they looked to her first, as though she were the true voice behind the throne. They pressed her to sway Stephen toward Constantinople, to remind him of his duty as son-in-law to the empire. Yet she was also queen of Hungary now, sworn to its crown, bound to its fate. Each demand from her kin tore at her loyalty, each suspicion from Hungarian nobles deepened her isolation. She walked the palace corridors like a woman standing between two altars, each demanding devotion, each condemning betrayal. If she leaned too far toward Byzantium, the Hungarian lords branded her traitor. If she pressed too closely to Rome, her own blood condemned her as disloyal. To exist in that tension was to live in a state of perpetual suspicion, where every gesture became evidence for one side or the other. For Stephen, the weight was equally unbearable. His crown was already tarnished by defeat, his body weakened by illness, his legitimacy shadowed by scandal. Now he was asked to choose between Rome and Constantinople, knowing that either choice could tear his kingdom apart. He leaned toward Rome at times, granting privileges to bishops in hopes of papal favor. At other times, he nodded toward Byzantium, using his queen's heritage as leverage for peace. Yet the more he tried to balance, the weaker he appeared. To his enemies, compromise looked like cowardice. To his allies, it looked like betrayal. The queen became his confidant in these storms. At night, when fevers burned his body and despair clouded his mind, she sat beside him, speaking softly of survival. She reminded him that strength was not only in conquest, but in endurance, that legitimacy could outlast defeat if dignity was preserved. Yet her own heart was torn. She longed for the marble sanctuaries of Constantinople, for the certainty of her family's power. Yet she knew her place was now in Hungary, chained to a throne that seemed to crumble beneath her. The court grew harsher. Nobles, emboldened by the king's indecision, began to form factions. Some allied with Rome, hoping papal favor would strengthen their local power. Others courted Byzantium, whispering that the queen herself might be the true guarantor of stability. And still others looked only to themselves, carving out estates as if the kingdom were already collapsing. In this storm, the queen's very existence became a political fault line. She bore it with composure, but inside she wrestled with a crisis of identity. Was she a Byzantine princess serving Hungary, or a Hungarian queen betraying Byzantium? Was she wife, partner, mother-to-be, or merely pawn? And if her husband died young, as so many feared, what would she be then? Widow, outcast, forgotten relic of a failed dynasty? In the chronicles of the time, little is written of her thoughts, but one can imagine the quiet wars fought within her, the silent prayers whispered in chapels, the restless nights where the weight of two empires pressed against her chest. She carried within her the paradox of queenship, that the very blood which made her valuable also made her dangerous, that her marriage was both shield and prison. For Hungary, this tension meant paralysis. The kingdom could not move decisively toward Rome for fear of alienating Byzantium. It could not embrace Byzantium fully for fear of papal wrath. Instead, it lingered in uncertainty, a state of fragile survival. And survival, though sometimes enough, never silences ambition. The Komnenos queen stood in the center of it all, foreign in blood, necessary in presence, mistrusted by many, yet indispensable to her husband's reign. She embodied the fragile balance of Hungary itself, torn between cross and crescent, between loyalty and suspicion, between survival and collapse. And in that balance, the kingdom trembled, waiting for the next storm to decide whether Hungary would endure, or whether Stephen's reign would be remembered only as a pause before the fall. In the wake of humiliation on the Adriatic and the suffocating tension between Rome and Byzantium, Hungary began to turn inward, devouring itself from within. What had once been a kingdom bound, however uneasily, under the will of Koloman, now became a patchwork of ambitions. The magnates, those lords who commanded vast estates and private armies, looked upon their young, weakened king and saw opportunity. They were wolves circling a stag, waiting for the moment to sink their teeth into the body of the realm. Stephen's authority was fragile at best. His illnesses kept him from the saddle, his defeats robbed him of prestige, and his attempts at diplomacy left him painted as indecisive. In a world where power respected only strength, he had little left to offer. And so the magnates began to carve. They seized crown lands under the guise of necessity, expanded their privileges with ink and sword, and demanded rights that eroded the very foundation of royal power. Hungary's kingdom became less a unified realm and more a federation of barons, each guarding his own fiefdom, each calculating how long the crown would last. The court itself became a theater of intrigue. Whispers of plots echoed in corridors. Alliances shifted with the turning of seasons. Men who once feasted at the king's table now plotted his replacement, or at the very least the reduction of his power to that of a ceremonial figure. In such an atmosphere, loyalty became rare, treachery common, and fear a permanent resident in the palace. For the Komnenos queen, this world of wolves was both a danger and an opportunity. Her very presence was polarizing. Some nobles despised her, accusing her of meddling in affairs of state, of using her Byzantine lineage to manipulate the crown. To them, she was an outsider, a foreign woman with no right to influence Hungarian politics. Yet others, wary of the king's weakness, sought her favor precisely because of her ties to Byzantium. They saw in her a bridge to imperial power, a connection that might preserve their fortunes should Hungary collapse. The queen navigated this treacherous landscape with the instincts she had learned in Constantinople, where palace intrigue was an art form, and survival often depended on silence and subtlety. She rarely spoke openly in council, but her presence was undeniable. When nobles raised their voices against the king, her stillness carried the weight of judgment. When factions clashed, her gaze could silence an argument, as though the authority of Byzantium itself lingered in her eyes. She was not given power formally, but she wielded it nonetheless, in the spaces between words, in the moments when silence spoke louder than decree. Yet the danger was constant. Each day brought new rumors, of plots to poison the king, of alliances forming in the shadows, of noble families raising private armies under the pretext of defense. The palace, meant to be the heart of the kingdom, became a cage filled with rival predators. Even the clergy played their part, siding with whichever faction offered greater privilege, cloaking ambition in the language of God. Stephen himself, weary and often bedridden, seemed increasingly detached. His bouts of illness left him weak, his spirit drained by the endless tide of betrayal. At times he rallied, summoning what remained of his strength to issue decrees or lead councils, but each effort left him diminished. He was a king by title, but in truth, power slipped further from his grasp with each passing season. In this vacuum, the queen's influence deepened. She became the steady figure at the center of chaos, the one constant presence in a court where loyalty was as fleeting as candlelight. She could not command armies, but she could command perception. And perception mattered. To many, she became the image of stability, the silent reminder that the crown still had dignity, even if the king faltered. Yet this came at a personal cost. Every move she made, every alliance she entertained, sharpened the suspicion that she was playing a game of her own, a Komnenos game of imperial ambition. Her nights were restless. She walked the corridors of the palace, listening to the silence between the guards' footsteps, feeling the weight of eyes upon her. She knew that one misstep, one careless word, could brand her a traitor. Yet she also knew that without her presence, the crown might collapse entirely. And so she endured, not with the joy of a bride, but with the steel of a survivor. Outside the palace walls, the kingdom fractured further. Local lords raised their banners, peasants groaned under heavier burdens, and the borders trembled as neighbors tested Hungary's weakness. The wolves inside the court mirrored the predators beyond its borders, and in the middle stood a sickly king and his Byzantine queen, struggling to hold together a kingdom that seemed intent on tearing itself apart. The queen understood what few others did. Survival was now victory. It was not about conquering Dalmatia or outmaneuvering Rome. It was about enduring, about keeping the crown upon her husband's head one day longer, one season longer, until perhaps fortune turned or a miracle came. It was a grim calculation, but it was the truth of their reign. And yet the more she endured, the more she became the subject of whispers. To some, she was a heroine, holding together a fragile kingdom. To others, she was a usurper, a foreign hand pulling the strings of Hungary. In truth, she was both less and more. Not a conqueror, not a traitor, but a woman trapped in a storm, surviving by instinct and resolve, carrying on her shoulders the invisible weight of a faltering crown. The wolves grew bolder, their howls echoing through Hungary's valleys and corridors alike. And as they closed in, Stephen's reign slipped further toward collapse, leaving his queen not only a partner, but the last fragile defense against a kingdom devouring itself. The Adriatic never forgave weakness. Its waves carried memory like salt, and its ports remembered who commanded them and who surrendered. For Stephen, the humiliation of Venice was a wound that never closed, a scar that bled in whispers across every noble hall of Hungary. To be remembered as the king who lost Dalmatia was intolerable. And so, though his body grew frailer with each passing season, he resolved upon one last gamble. The boy king, now a young man but aged by illness and failure, would march once more toward the coast. He would reclaim Dalmatia, or he would be crushed beneath its waves. The decision was not born of strategy, but of pride, of desperation to carve into history something other than defeat. His counselors urged caution. The nobles, ever calculating, offered tepid support, some even withholding troops under the guise of protecting their estates. But Stephen pressed forward, summoning what strength remained. He ordered banners raised, armor fitted, horses readied. Once more the kingdom's army marched, not with the vigor of conquest, but with the uneasy shuffle of men who suspected they were marching into ruin. The queen watched in silence as preparations unfolded. She had seen the toll the first campaign had taken on her husband, the way defeat had hollowed his spirit and worsened his illness. She knew that this new campaign was not the march of a king confident in his might, but the desperate stride of a man seeking redemption. Yet she also knew she could not stop him. To oppose him would be to strip away the last thread of dignity he clung to. And so she stood beside him, regal in Byzantine silk, her face unreadable, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she was watching her husband gamble what remained of both his strength and his reign. The army reached Dalmatia, and the Venetians were ready. Their fleets dominated the sea. Their defenses were reinforced, their coffers filled with the wealth of trade. Against them stood Hungary's disunited lords, reluctant soldiers, and a king whose body was weaker than his will. The clashes were swift and merciless. Venetian ships cut through Hungarian supply lines. Coastal cities barred their gates, and Hungarian banners fell one after another. The defeat was total. Where Stephen had hoped for glory, he found only humiliation deeper than before. Dalmatia was lost forever, its ports absorbed fully into Venice's dominion, its memory burned into Hungarian shame. And the king, who had staked what little remained of his honor on this campaign, returned broken. His sword had not been shattered in battle, but in spirit. When he entered the palace again, it was not to cheers or ceremony, but to silence. Nobles turned their faces away, unwilling to meet his eyes. The clergy muttered that his reign was cursed, and the people, though silent, carried disappointment like a weight that pressed upon him more than any illness. Stephen had failed again, and now his failures defined him more than his crown. In the quiet chambers of the palace, the queen became his only witness. She sat beside him as he stared into the emptiness of defeat, his hands trembling, his body weakened by fever. He spoke little, for there was little to say. What words could bridge the gulf between intention and reality, between pride and humiliation? He carried within him the knowledge that he would never be remembered as a conqueror, never as a restorer of Hungary's greatness, but as the king who lost what his father had held. The queen bore this with him, but in her own silence, she carried her own burden. To be the wife of a failing king was to live in the crossfire of accusation. Some blamed her for distracting him, others accused her of Byzantine manipulation. Still others whispered that her womb's barrenness had cursed the crown itself. She endured it all without outward protest, her composure unbroken, but inside she felt the sting of every rumor, every sideways glance. And yet in that silence, her role grew more profound. She became not just queen but caretaker, not just partner but anchor. Where the kingdom saw only weakness, she offered dignity. Where the nobles whispered of collapse, she stood as reminder that Hungary still bore the sheen of Byzantium's alliance. And where her husband faltered, she preserved what little humanity remained to him. The defeat in Dalmatia did not just wound Stephen's reign, it broke something within him. His health, already fragile, declined more rapidly. His spirit, once restless with ambition, now sank into resignation. He attended councils less frequently, spoke less often, allowed nobles greater leeway than ever before. The crown sat upon his head, but it no longer carried command. It was as though he had become a ghost of kingship, a shadow in his own reign. The queen, by contrast, became more visible, not in decrees or proclamations, but in the quiet authority she carried. She walked through the palace with the posture of Byzantium, reminding those who watched that the crown, though weakened, still had dignity. In ceremonies, her presence covered his absences. In the corridors, her silence quelled some of the worst ambitions. She was no usurper, but without her, the kingdom's decline would have been even swifter. But her power was fragile, born of perception rather than decree, and perception could change in an instant. She knew it. Each day she lived with the knowledge that her position was precarious, that one accusation, one misstep, could cast her as scapegoat for all the kingdom's failings. And yet she endured, for to abandon her husband would be to abandon herself, to become nothing but a forgotten pawn in the empire's endless game. The broken sword of Dalmatia hung over them both. For Stephen, it was the end of hope for triumph. For his queen, it was the beginning of a new reality, that her life would not be measured in victories, but in the endurance of decline. The Adriatic winds carried away the last embers of Hungarian pride, leaving behind only silence, suspicion, and a fragile queen who now stood as the last visible thread, holding together a kingdom unraveling from within. There are thrones secured by sons, and there are thrones held together by silence. Stephen's was the latter, and the silence grew heavier. Each year, the royal cradle remained empty. In a world where the future of a kingdom could be measured in swaddling cloth, the absence of an heir was not a private sorrow, but a public crisis, a ledger entry against the crown. In that arithmetic, the Komnenos queen's body was conscripted into the state. Priests prayed over her. Midwives hovered near her apartments as if proximity could conjure destiny. Courtiers studied her face for signs of blessing or curse. The realm learned to wait, and waiting became a judgment. At first the court preferred hope. They whispered of time, of youth, of God's favor still to be revealed. But seasons passed, and the tone changed. The same nobles who had once praised the marriage as a triumph of diplomacy now hinted that Byzantium had sent Hungary a jewel with no seed. The same bishops who had blessed the union began to speak of penance and vows, of saints to be invoked and sins to be confessed. In that shifting chorus, the queen stood immovable, a figure carved from patience, refusing to let her dignity be measured by the mercy of rumor. Stephen bore the pressure differently. He had failed at sea, he could not fail at succession. Yet the body cannot be commanded by decree, and what could not be commanded became a torment. The more his health faltered, the more he needed the promise of continuity to steady the realm. The more that promise receded, the more the realm looked past him. Ministers spoke to the future in the presence of a living king. Magnates weighed loyalties not to his crown, but to the crowns that might follow. Succession, once a path, became a battlefield drawn across the map of his family. Names emerged like banners in the wind, a nephew, promising and acceptable to factions that wanted a pliable youth blessed by the king's favor. A blinded cousin, survivor of earlier cruelties, whose very maiming had become a rallying emblem for men who dreamed of redress. Each name was wrapped in the logic of necessity and the perfume of principle. Some pleaded for proximity of blood, others for stability, still others for revenge smuggled in under the cloak of legitimacy. None of these arguments was made in the queen's presence, and yet all of them were aimed through her, at her, because the quarrel existed only because her womb had failed to close it. She understood this with clarity, brutal as winter. She had been raised among marble and rites to believe that a queen's chief work was to turn a marriage into a dynasty. Now she learned the harsher catechism of the frontier, that a queen's chief work might be to absorb the blows meant for a crown that could no longer endure them. She did not plead. She did not explain. She allowed ceremonies to do what explanation could not. Processions, fasts, almsgiving, vigils in chapels dense with candle smoke. If a realm must measure its hope in rituals, let the rituals be unbroken and stately. From outside, it looked like passivity. From within, it was discipline, refusing to let despair rewrite the choreography of rule. The palace mirrored the country's unease. Corridors became long arguments. Councils bled into confessions. A hush followed the queen like a tide. Groups scattered as she approached, dense again when she passed, their fragments of talk finishing in her wake. She carried herself with the studied serenity of Constantinople, but the air around her sharpened with the glassy edge of speculation. A foreigner without a child is always a stranger twice. She learned to breathe in that thin atmosphere, to make silence her armor and ceremony her pulse. Stephen, who had once reached for redemption in the roar of the Adriatic, now moved more slowly, as if the palace itself were heavy to cross. On days when strength favored him, he tried to do what kings try, to name the shape of the future into being. He received envoys, issued favors to tie wavering men to his cause, spoke softly of unity to nobles who recognized only the arithmetic of gain. Yet even when his voice steadied, the present betrayed him. The tremor of a hand, the pale sweat on the brow before a council adjourned, the way his gaze drifted, just for a heartbeat, toward the door as if to measure the distance to rest. The queen did not pretend otherwise. She moved the household around his weakness, the way a careful steward shifts load-bearing beams in a house built on old ground. Audiences were shortened without seeming short. Liturgies were lengthened to cover gaps of governance with incense and Latin. When the king could not preside, she sat with a poise that did not claim authority, yet denied vacancy. She knew the limits. She never spoke as sovereign, never signed, never commanded. But there are atmospheres that rule more surely than edicts, and it was the atmosphere she governed, the sense that the crown still had a center. Outside, the country adjusted itself to contingency. Some lords trained their sons in the etiquette of a court that might change masters. Others drilled men on private fields until they moved like water, their discipline a warning and a promise. At border castles, captains weighed which oath would most likely outlast the winter. The church, reading both weather and the scripture, counseled prayer, but practiced prudence. Its abbots, careful to accept endowments stamped with the king's seal, while keeping cordial notes for any successor who might prefer a different hand at the inkstone. Whispers honed themselves into accusations. Not the crude cruelty of street corners, but the dry paper cuts of learned men. Treatises on marriage, citations of councils, analogies to empires that withered when heirs were not supplied. The queen read none of them. She could recite their arguments by heart. She answered them the only way that would not degrade the crown, by going on. She refused the theater of collapse. She rose when bells demanded, sat when the ritual required, walked when the dignity of the throne needed feet. The small obediences of office became her resistance to the grand disobedience of fate. There were moments, few unrecorded, when tenderness bent the iron of days. A late light through a narrow window, the king's hand steady on hers after weeks of tremor. A laugh not staged for anyone's reassurance, but arriving of its own accord like an unseasonable bird. In such instance, the marriage was not emblem or policy, but the simple fellowship of two lives learning to carry what could not be put down. The court did not see those hours. The kingdom could not be built upon them. But they were real, and reality, even without posterity, is not nothing. Inevitably, the factions sharpened. The argument for a designated heir hardened into petitions, and petitions into demands. To ignore them was to invite a scramble at the grave. To answer them was to begin the end in public. The queen counseled what she had learned in her father's halls, that when a king must concede, he must fashion concession into ceremony, lest necessity look like surrender. Let the choice be framed as mercy, not fear, as prudence, not defeat. Let the palace proclaim that the future had been considered at leisure rather than rested in a night of panic. If dignity is the last currency of a failing reign, spend it with care. So proclamations were drafted with velvet clauses. Kinship was extolled, continuity praised, the favor of heaven invoked. The named successor, whoever stood behind the curtain of royal phrasing, was acknowledged not as the crown's replacement, but as its extension, to be unsealed upon God's chosen hour. Men read what they wished into the lines. Those who feared civil fracture breathed a little easier. Those who plotted saw in the careful language a map of the palace's weak doors. The realm did not steady, but the tremor slowed, like a hand on the verge of a spill that pauses without setting the cup down. In the galleries, the queen walked beneath tapestries where mothers held princelings the size of pigeons, stitched saints lowering halos over swaddled heirs. She did not look away. If history answers prayer with embroidery, she could at least meet its stare. The women who had borne the future into palaces were woven in wool and gold. She would be remembered, if at all, as an outline behind a king, a figure in the negative space of failure. There are dynasties built by men of action and dynasties preserved by women who learned to stand without witnesses. She knew which story was hers. As autumns returned and the border trees thinned, the kingdom learned a new calendar, not harvest and Lent, but remission and relapse. When Stephen rallied, the court rehearsed stability. When he sank, the court rehearsed absence. The queen chaperoned both performances, never letting rehearsal become confession. That discipline was her gift to the country that would not call her daughter, the refusal to let the crown dissolve in spectacle. Yet even discipline frays. There came evenings when the corridors felt longer, when the candles smoked more than they burned, when the future spoke not in arguments but in the soft certainty of footfalls gathering behind doors. The queen listened to that certainty and found no petition left to write, no ceremony left to stage that could stretch the present into something like safety. She had kept a center for as long as a human will can keep one. The ring had not broken, but the metal thinned. In such a narrowing, prayer becomes less a request than a posture. She went on kneeling, not because she expected a miracle writ in a cradle, but because the kneeling held the palace to its shape. She understood that the kingdom no longer needed her to deliver an heir. It needed her to deliver an ending that would not set fire to the beginning of the next reign. Some queens are mothers of kings. Others mother the hour between kings. It is a different kind of labor, and history rarely gives it a name. When the bells marked another vigil, their sound was less a summons than a reckoning. The country had measured her by children and found her wanting. The court had measured her by steadiness and unwillingly found her indispensable. Between those measurements she stood, Byzantine in bearing, Hungarian by vow, and entirely herself in the stubbornness that refuses to let a story end in collapse. The cradle was empty, but the throne was not, and as long as it was not, she would hold its place against the dark. And so Part 8 closes not with a birth but with a vigil, a queen without a son, a king without a future secured, a realm that has learned to balance on the narrow ledge between reverence and fear. The silence around them is not absence, but the gathered breath before a final season. A silence that asks whether dignity, held long enough, can be a legacy when victory is denied. Autumn in Hungary had always carried a strange beauty. The Carpathian hills turned crimson and gold. The rivers slowed into reflective pools, and the air grew heavy with the scent of harvested fields. But in the autumn of Stephen's 29th year, beauty was haunted by a shadow. The king's body, once frail but resilient, was failing in earnest now. His steps grew shorter, his hands trembled more often, his eyes dimmed with the exhaustion of a man who had fought not for victory, but for the right to remain standing. The palace, usually alive with the bustle of courtiers and the business of state, moved in muted tones, as though already preparing for morning. The queen walked through this season with a composure that masked her inner storm. She had lived in Hungary long enough to understand the weight of rumor, and rumor now ran faster than the Danube. Whispers echoed that the king would not survive the winter, that his crown was already shifting to the hands of others. That loyalty to Stephen was a bet placed too late. The quarters no longer belonged to him. They belonged to the future, to the nobles and factions maneuvering in anticipation of his death. Stephen himself seemed to sense it. In councils, he appeared less frequently, leaving nobles to debate among themselves. On the rare occasions he did speak, his voice carried not command but resignation, the tone of a man who had come to terms with the futility of resistance. His reign had been marked by losses, by illness, by humiliation. Now in these final months, he seemed almost relieved to loosen his grip, to let the crown drift from his failing hands. For the queen, this resignation was unbearable. She had watched him stumble through war and defeat, through illness and humiliation, and had stood by him with the unyielding posture of Byzantium. Now, as he slipped deeper into decline, she carried not only his burdens but her own isolation. She was still foreign in the eyes of many. To some, she was the embodiment of Byzantine manipulation. To others, the reminder of a childless marriage that had doomed the dynasty. Yet she endured, tending to him when no counsel dared to intrude, speaking to him when silence pressed too heavily, ensuring that dignity remained even as strength failed. The palace itself mirrored the king's condition. Guards performed their duties more slowly, servants whispered in corners, and the nobles grew restless. Bela the Blind, Colomon's nephew, once cast aside and mutilated in a struggle for power, now loomed as the likely successor. His very presence carried the weight of vengeance and the uncertainty of what Hungary would become under him. Some nobles pledged allegiance quietly, others schemed for advantage, while a few clung to Stephen out of loyalty or inertia. The court had become a liminal space, suspended between two reigns, a place where the living king was already treated as a shadow. For Stephen, this knowledge was poison. He knew the crown no longer commanded respect. He could feel it in the way his nobles averted their eyes, in the way foreign envoys spoke of Hungary's future without addressing him directly. Yet even as his body faltered, there remained a spark of defiance. In rare moments of clarity, he spoke of Hungary's dignity, of the need to protect it from wolves both within and without. These were not plans for victory, but pleas for endurance, echoes of a king who had once hoped to be remembered for triumph. The queen, however, bore a different burden. She was not only a wife watching her husband fade, she was a queen witnessing the unraveling of a marriage, a reign, a dynasty. The absence of an heir meant she had no place in the future being built around her. She would not be mother to the next king, nor guardian of a child king's throne. She would be, at best, a relic of a failed reign, at worst, a scapegoat for its collapse. The thought weighed heavily upon her, but she did not let it show. Her posture remained regal, her silence unbroken, her gaze steady. If she could not give the kingdom an heir, she would at least give it the dignity of a queen unbowed. As autumn deepened, the king's decline became undeniable. Fevers racked him, leaving him bedridden for days. Priests gathered more frequently at his bedside, offering prayers and sacraments. Nobles visited less often, their loyalties already drifting elsewhere. The queen remained constant, sitting beside him through the long nights, tending to him when his body shook with weakness, listening when he spoke of regrets too heavy to carry alone. He spoke of Dalmatia, of the Adriatic lost forever, of the shame that haunted him. He spoke of his mother's scandal and how its shadow had never left him. And he spoke of her, his queen, not as foreigner or scapegoat, but as the one presence that had never abandoned him. These confessions did not heal him, but they brought a fragile peace. In her presence, he could be not a failed king, but simply a man, weary of burdens too heavy for his frail body. And in her silence, he found the only absolution still available, the knowledge that she had not judged him unworthy. Yet outside their chamber, the kingdom moved forward without him. The machinery of succession began to grind into motion. Bela the Blind gathered support. Factions sharpened their knives, both literal and political. The crown of St. Stephen, once the symbol of unity, became the object of calculation. The last autumn of the king was not marked by harvests or victories, but by the quiet, ruthless preparations for a world after him. The queen knew this, felt it in every cold glance, every muted conversation. She walked the corridors with the composure of marble. But she understood the truth. The court was already writing her out of the story. And yet she endured. She endured because Stephen still lived, because the crown, though fragile, still gleamed, because dignity, however tattered, was still worth defending. The last autumn of a king is not measured in victories, but in silences. The silence of nobles waiting for his death, the silence of a crown slipping from his grasp, the silence of a queen who carried what history would not record. And in that silence, Stephen of Hungary moved toward his final winter, leaving behind not the legacy of triumph, but the echo of endurance. Winter arrived early, as if the season itself wished to draw a veil across Hungary before the court could decide what to call the end. Snow softened the outlines of the palace, turned battlements into pale mounds, muffled the sound of hooves in the courtyards. Inside, the air was heavy with smoke and vigil, priests cycling prayers, servants moving with the economy of people who have practiced grief into ritual. Stephen's world had narrowed to a bed, a window, and the steady presence of the woman who would know him last. The crown lay not in his chamber, but in the chapel, where candles wove light across its enamel and pearls, as though the object could keep shining without a head to lend it height. When death came, it did not announce itself with spectacle. There was no clash of arms, no gathered multitude in a square. Only the long quiet of a work completed by the body against its will. A physician placed fingers at the wrist and found only the memory of a pulse. The priest withdrew the spoon from lips that would not take the final drop. The queen, who had learned by then the thousand small sounds of dying, simply bowed her head. In that minute, the kingdom moved forward without asking permission. Snow fell, a page ran, a bell tolled once, then again. Then in a rhythm that drew people out of rooms and thoughts and private bargains into the single word the bell was saying, finished. Death tidies what argument cannot. The nobles who had whispered through corridors now stepped into the formal movements of succession. Bela, the blinded kinsman whose name had hung for months like a decision deferred, was lifted toward the throne. He would be king, not because the court loved him, but because the machinery of inheritance once engaged cares little for love. Men who had practiced caution now practiced conviction. Their faces arranged themselves into the expressions appropriate to the hour. Grief before the bier, loyalty before the new standard, calculation in the space between the two. For a few days, Stephen was everything he had not been allowed to be in life. A king without opposition, draped, processed, sung over. He moved one last time through his own palace, carried by the arms of men who had not carried him in council. Priests layered him with prayers old as the kingdom's memory. The great cloths that rarely left their chests were taken out and spread, their embroidery thick with saints and victories that had not been his. The court, relieved to have a script to follow, surrendered to it. Grief performed itself properly. The living rehearsed their new loyalties in the way they knelt, in the way they rose. The queen's part in this liturgy seemed small, and that smallness was its own magnitude. Veiled in black, she stood where a widow stands, not at the center, but at the point from which the center could be seen. People watched her the way people watch a flame at the end of a wick, for the moment it gives up and for the shape of the last light. She did not tremble. The Komnenos schooling was not for trembling. The posture that had steadied councils now steadied the end. It was not a triumph, but it kept the kingdom from dissolving in the emotion that gathers at the lip of a grave and would, if indulged, pour the future into it. There are kinds of power that do not leave documents behind. A woman's endurance at a bed, a queen's refusal to let grief become theater, the decision to rise one heartbeat before the master of ceremonies calls her name so that he does not command the rhythm of her legs. None of this finds its way into charters. The scribes, busy with lines and seals, will record dates and names in the proper phrases that establish continuity. They will say Stephen died and Bela reigned, and they will be correct. They will not say that for 3 winters running, the queen learned by sound which footstep was the physician's and which the priest's, or that she did the arithmetic of candles like a treasurer of a very small but necessary light. The crown raised again from the chapel, passed through a chamber where she stood. For an instant it caught a ribbon of sun slipping between clouds and glass. Jewels scatter light not in circles but in fragments, and in those fragments she saw a decade as it had truly been. Not a line but a refraction, war slicing one way, illness another, marriage sending its thin beam through them both. The men carrying the crown did not pause. They were hurrying it toward the next forehead, which was their duty. She did not reach for it. That would have been a kind of melodrama she had never allowed herself. She only inclined her head as if acknowledging the physics. Light moves, crowns move. The human neck learns to bow without learning to break. Bella's acclamation tightened the weave of the realm. Oaths were taken with the energy of relief. What had been provisional became again declarative. The bishops, generous in grief, were precise in order. Captains at border castles received the news in tones that meant garrisons would not change hands tonight. Coins would soon stamp a different image. Measurements, taxes, marriages, judgments would flow again along the channels that had silted as the old reign narrowed to a sick room. Government is, after all, a system for persuading many hands to do the same work on the same day. To live beyond a reign is its own sort of exile. The queen woke on a morning not long after the funeral to a palace that had adjusted itself by imperceptible degrees, but absolute effect. A steward she had known for years now bowed at an angle 15 degrees shallower. A doorkeeper's eyes, which had always met hers as an equal in keeping corridors orderly, now glanced to the side, waiting for instruction from a rank that was not hers. A boy, new, eager, miscalibrated, used the title due to her, but his voice put on it the softness used for relics. It did not offend her. She had trained herself to take inventory without petition. This is how the room is arranged now. Move through it or be moved by it. The future offered 3 paths and withheld their endings. She could remain in Hungary, a widow of ceremonial rank, visible enough to be resented, invisible enough to be forgotten, her apartments slowly shrinking the way a shoreline does when a river's course changes. She could, at the invitation of blood, in the quiet insistence of memory, return to Constantinople, where her Komnenos kin would receive her with the etiquette that covers estrangement with honey. She could withdraw from both courts into a religious house, trading a crown's porous privacy for the careful cloister of vowed hours. Each path had its mathematics. Dignity here paid out in small coins. Dignity there paid out in speech that would not mention failure. Dignity elsewhere paid out in a silence that would not be a void, because bells would divide it. Diplomacy, which had used her once as instrument, now extended terms. A letter from the south arrived couched in the language of kinship and concern, bearing the weight of a purple seal and the temperature of a city she had not felt on her skin in years. The messenger waited with the patient attention of a man entrusted with the dignity of distance. A note from a Hungarian prelate, sincere in its way, offered the blessing of a patronage that would keep her comfortable, which is to say, proximate to small humiliations and larger kindnesses. A whisper from a lady who owed her a decade-old protection suggested the name of an abbess, who would keep her even from whispers. She did not answer at once. The decision could not be a flinch. She walked the palace as if to measure it with her body, the way one learns a room before one must navigate it at night. She sat in the chapel where she and Stephen had more than once let prayer do their talking. And she measured how much of her grief belonged to the man and how much to the shared enterprise of holding a crown stable by holding her own posture. She stood at a window from which the yard could be seen thawing under hoof and boot, and asked herself without eloquence whether a return to Byzantium would be return or merely a different kind of foreignness in a city that had stored her in the drawer labeled utility. History does not record which door she took. It records only that she stepped out of its frame. Chroniclers, busy with kings and campaigns, let her sentence close without a flourish. This is not negligence, but the bias of a certain kind of telling. Men who lead armies leave marks in the ground. Women who keep the ground from opening beneath those men leave marks in the air. The air does not hold ink. A century later, a monk copying an older text will put his stylus down at her name and look toward the window and see only weather. There is a temptation, in the absence of detail, to assemble a consoling picture. One could place her on a ship moving down the Danube, its wake braiding water into the pattern of a life unspooling from one court back toward another. One could set her in a convent garden, winter's branches making their undecorated argument for endurance, while she learns a new schedule of bells, and with it, a new piece. One could keep her in Buddha's shadow, a figure in a second-row gallery, her presence so composed that the new court forgets to resent it. Each possibility contains a truth about what queens do when no longer staged. They continue. They accept that a life can be a duty even when the crown that made it so has moved on to another brow. What cannot be conjectured is what she had already accomplished, because accomplishment is too thin a word for it. She had intercepted panic and turned it into liturgy. She had taken humiliation, the kingdoms and her husband's, and refused to let it metastasize into disgrace. She had failed, yes, at the function a court most crudely assigns to a consort. She had not given a child, but she had given a duration, stretching the reign's fabric across rents great enough to have torn it into flags. If the next king's first day began on a floor that did not tilt, it began on a floor she had kept level, the least celebratory, most necessary of labors. The first months of Bela's rule confirmed the accuracy of her reading of the realm. The nobility, whom she had called wolves in her private arithmetic, now learned new habits under a hand that could neither see their flattery nor be moved by their charms. Punishments remembered and promises deferred came due. The court discovered, with the shiver a body feels in winter when wind finds a gap in the door, that the kindness of a failing rain is not a moral quality, but a function of fatigue. The queen, removed now from the immediate blast of policy, heard the report stripped of counsel's perfume. She did not exult. She was not built for the warmth of other people's cold. In time, the country rethreaded itself, as countries do. Fields were sown, taxes collected, marriages arranged, borders negotiated, churches endowed, documents piled. Children who would never remember Stephen learned the names of saints and founders. The tapestries forgot to portray him in the central panel. The crown, which had made its way across a corridor past her unextended hand, learned the angle and temperature of a different skull. Life reassumed its purpose, which is not to honor the past but to extend itself. What remains of Stephen's reign after the ledgers and the banners and the careful deaths at the edges of maps are added up is not a list but a mood. The knowledge that sometimes a country must be carried through a narrow place by people no one will sing about. The men who will be citizens of Hungary 2, 3, 5 generations hence will walk across bridges and hear stories of saints and warriors and wise kings. They will not hear the story of a woman who learned how to turn an emptiness into a form and held that form with such steadiness that thousands of other people's lives were not dumped into chaos. They will not hear how, in rooms without windows open to history, she made time behave. And yet, if one stands in a chapel where the crown is kept, if one waits long enough for tourists to leave and custodians to lean their mops against walls and quiet to return to the shape the building prefers, one can see it. The case casts reflections that have no practical use. A winter sun, unambitious, touches a stone. A blue thread in a rug looks for an instant like water. The crown itself, rearranging light across its facets, seems to practice the paradox it lives on, that it is both object and idea, metal and memory, present and charged with all the foreheads it has pressed. In that paradox lives the queen's afterlife. Byzantium's gift, or Hungary's curse, both are clumsy. Gifts bind, curses bind, her presence bound. It kept the kingdom attached to something during the years it might have slipped loose. If the price of that attachment was suspicion, it was paid. If the cost of that binding was a life reduced by chroniclers to a clause, it was accepted. There is a grandeur past the reach of epics, the grandeur of things that do not break. The widow, wherever she went, carried that grandeur in the invisible way certain women do, neither announcing it nor relinquishing it. If she returned to Constantinople, she would have walked through colonnades that once trained her to be an instrument, and now discovered how an instrument sounds when played by time instead of policy. If she remained in Hungary, she would have traversed corridors as familiar as the furniture of a story one has told so many times that it no longer needs words. If she chose the convent, she would have traded one habit for another without considering it a loss, but a reduction to scale. In every version, the same work continued, to keep the hour from breaking around her. The camera cannot linger forever. The palace grows dark. The chapel locks. The custodians finish their work. Snow finishes what it began and then withdraws, letting mud write its brief gospel of passage before grass overwrites both. The crown stays, the names change. A king dies, another reigns, and the quiet this time is not a pause but a medium, the place where light passes from one facet to another. She had been the medium, not the brightness, not the metal, but the movement of brightness. Not Byzantium's gift or Hungary's curse, but the still hand that made the transfer possible. Cinematic endings prefer a door closing or a ship vanishing into a pale horizon. This story refuses both. The door is open because the work it frames does not end. The ship is not vanishing, it is ferrying time, which is not ours to keep. What remains is a paradox meant to be left in the mind like a small stone in the pocket, a reign measured by losses and a queen measured by what did not happen because she stood there. The vanishing throne did not fall, it dimmed, and in dimming, it found its way to the next morning. That is not a curse and not a gift. It is stubbornly and magnificently a legacy.